I'm coming to you from the and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe people. Much of the history I have learned about Indigenous people wasn't taught to me growing up in Toronto, in Canada. Instead, the history and current state of Indigenous peoples is something that I have been committed to learning as an adult. I encourage all of you who are similarly seeking to unlearn and learn the true history of the Indigenous people to perhaps consider as a starting point the Indigenous Canada course at the University of Alberta, which is a free online course to begin your journey. As mentioned, this presentation is going to attempt to be recorded and will be made in English. The presentation has also been sent out. I'm sure the question will be coming up during the course of the presentation repeatedly around getting a copy of the presentation. It has been sent out, and it might differ slightly from the presentation you see here, as we've removed some of the animations and made it just a little bit more succinct. I wanted to say that before we begin, I'm actually nervous on this presentation for two reasons. I'm nervous for this presentation because I've actually been a beneficiary of the work that IDNEED has done through the last at least 2 years. The work that's happened here has been a source of tremendous strength for those of us who have been active participants. There's been knowledge sharing. There's been meetings where I've taken information from either IDNEED or the Anti-Racism Ambassadors Network over to executives, and they've been like, where are you getting this information from? It's a source of tremendous strength for us to be able to connect here like this. And I am glad to finally be giving back just a little bit to the network that has given so much to so many people. So to Marilyn, to Ali, to others who've made this possible, very, very grateful. Although I have presented this presentation in probably close to 20 different places, mainly in CRA, it is the first time that I will be presenting with Dr. Nicholas, with Catalina Albury, and with Brittany Vongdara, all of whom have really played a big role in in helping to promote the Disproportionality Index. So let me start by sharing my screen, and we will begin. If Brittany and Catalina are here, would love to see their faces as well as I get set up here. Okay. So just to go through the agenda over the next little bit, the opening remarks are going to be given by Dr. Nicholas. We will then go through a little bit of a context here around what is a disproportionality index? How was this thing created? What's the support for a disproportionality index? And then going through some data visualization around how do we get equity, and what is the role that equality plays in achieving equity? Lots of times these terms are kind of put together and used interchangeably, and we wanted to actually walk through how equality is a mechanism that we can use to, or equity is a mechanism to achieve equality. We will then go into the disproportionality index, and as mentioned, this presentation will be made available. So for those of you who don't have it, we'll make sure that it does get over to you. And then we will end with next steps. So without further ado, Dr. Nicholas, I'll throw it over you for opening remarks.
Thank you, Shamir. And thank you, Marilyn and Ali. Like Shamir said, the need and Aaron have been so much in the forefront in terms of anti-racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion. As many of you on this call may recall that the I made this presentation in June of 2022 with Aaron, and actually the whole concept I had started even before that. And I want to take a few minutes to talk about that because it is very important. Uh, the whole idea of this disproportionality index came when I was working on projecting workforce availability. Now, you may be pleased to know that Justice Canada has actually implemented the projection of workforce availability because I would hope that each one of you take note of this, that while we talk about systemic discrimination, while we talk about disaggregated data, we should realize that it is right in front of our face. Systemic racial discrimination is right in front of our face in terms of the way we apply the Employment Equity Act. Because right now, for 7 years, we are still using 2016 data. Just imagine if your salaries were kept at the 2016 level and not made any and changes were not made for inflation. Would you be happy? I do not think so. So the question is that WFA non-projection is adversely affects visible minorities or racialized people. It does not affect the other groups to any significant extent. It affects the indigenous people also to some extent, but the others, the way we do it, it does not affect. And so it is not acceptable. It's unconscionable that we still allow 2016 numbers to be used when we have a projection method to be done. The projection should be mandatory. Like, even though the Employment Equity Act may allow us to use it from a substantive equality perspective, which is a charter right in terms of substantive equality, we must do these projections. And I call upon each one of you on this call to go back to your departments and ask why. And if they say they do not have a method, tell them to contact Justice Canada. We do have a method. And in fact, Justice Canada is now looking to project to 2023. So they are projecting to 2023 while the rest of you are still in 2016. So that is a sorry state of affairs. The other thing is we have the national standard for psychological health and safety in Canada. It has been there for about 10 years for the workplaces. But anti-racism is not a factor. That is not acceptable. So right now, Health Canada has agreed to accept it. And I think there are some other departments who are considering to add it. And I hope that anybody interested in anti-racism would raise it with their own departments that this should be done. So while we were doing these projections, one thing we realized was there is no workforce availability or labor market availability for Black employees of any of the subcategories. So then it becomes a problem where there's a tendency just to look at the overall representation and not look at how it may be distributed. So that was the trigger to develop this disproportionality index, because people were looking at overall representation and saying, well, Blacks are being represented fairly well. They match the population figures because there is no availability. So this is where, when I looked at the salary levels, I realized that here is an opportunity to divide these in a particular way to show the stagnation. So that was what was done in terms of because normally governments do this all the time. They look at if it's economic income, they divide it into 5 groups based on the what you call the percentiles. So there's a lot done on the top 20th percentile and the bottom 20th percentile. So this is what I did in terms of the salary levels, which Shamir and Catalina and Brittany would explain, is that by doing that, so the question is not about representation, is a question of how they are represented. For many years, we have talked about this, even with the clerk, and it may be interesting to note that 2 weeks before the call to action was issued, Richard Sharp and some of us met with the clerk, and he then and we talked about the WFAs, we talked about black representation, we talked about nothing being done, and he said, hold on, in a few weeks time you will be surprised to see something very substantive. And I must say, in my 35-year career, this is the most substantive measure that has been brought forward as a policy from the head of the public service. So it's up to us to implement it. And there are lots of people who try to give excuses. And today we present you irrevocable evidence that says that you have to make black focused action. And I'm happy that Robert Cleary is going to talk about call to action, because that is the opportunity for us to do it. So without further ado, I will give it back to Shamir to talk about this. And please note that substantive equality is something that we all need to know about. Without that, we will be faced with unnecessary objections, invalid objections. So we need to educate ourselves about substantive equality. Thank you, Shamir.
Thanks, Dr. Nicholas. And the volume of work from this public servant has been something that is quite inspiring. And it was actually, thank you for the reminder, Dr. Nicholas, because it was at that Aaron meeting where the disproportionality index was I came into it, and I was having trouble trying to understand what was happening. And I got in touch with Dr. Nicholas, and from there we started to work with others to try to go ahead and see if there's a way we could come up with a way to explain this to the masses. And that's really been the core of a lot of our work, is trying to communicate the importance of this. What's really interesting about what you're about to see is it has been presented in many forums. There can't be individuals who say that they don't know about it, as the word continues to grow about this. So at the heart of all of this is substantive equality, and we'll be talking more about that very, very soon. So let me throw it over to Brittany to talk about what is a disproportionality index. Brittany, over to you.
Hi, my name is Brittany Bongera. My pronouns are she, her. I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, which is located in the unceded and unconquered territory of the Anishinaabe. And I'll speak to you about what the Disproportionality Index is, or the DI, like we like to call it formally. So the Disproportionality Index is a statistical measure used to determine whether there are differences or disparities between different groups in a particular situation or context. It's often used in social science research to identify potential inequalities in areas such as education, employment, healthcare, or criminal justice. The index typically compares the proportion of one group's representation in a particular outcome. So, for example, the number of students in special education programs to the proportion of that group's representation in the overall population. If the representation in the outcome is significantly higher or lower, then that would be the expected based on the population size. This suggests that there may be a disproportionality issue that needs to be further investigated. So how is it created? The Disproportionality Index was created by Dr. Martin Nicholas, and a partnership for the data visualization of the Disproportionality Index and salary analysis was created by Dr. Martin Nicholas from Justice Canada, Catalina Alberry, myself, Brittany Bongera from Statistics Canada, and Shamir Kanji from Canada Revenue Agency, with support from the Data Science Network and the Anti-Racism Ambassadors Network. And I'll go into the support for a disproportionality index. So support for this would include substantive equality, data for racial justice, and the call to action. So for substantive equality, it's achieved when one takes into account where necessary the differences in characteristics and circumstances of minority communities and provides services with distinct content or using a different method of delivery to ensure that the minority receives our services of the same quality as the majority. This approach is the norm for Canadian law, which aims for equal access, opportunity, and outcomes. And I want to take a brief moment to reference back to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, section 15.1 and section 15.2. 15.1, which speaks to equality before and under law and equal protection benefit of the law, states that every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination and, in particular, without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. And section 15.2, which speaks to affirmative action programs and states that subsection 1 does not preclude any law, program, or activity that has as its object the amelioration of conditions of disadvantaged individuals or groups, including those that are disadvantaged because of race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. In 2019, the Data for Racial Justice put out by the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commission noted that the analysis of disaggregated data were crucial to inform policy priorities relating to equality and opportunity for people of African descent. In addition, the refusal by some states to collect and disaggregate data based on race and ethnicity was one of the most serious impediments of the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. In 2021, the Privy Council's call to action included that measuring progress and deriving improvements in the employee workplace and experience by monitoring disaggregated survey results and related operations data, for example, promotion and mobility rights, tenure, etc., and acting on what the results are telling us. And with that, I'll pass it off to Catalina to go into the next couple slides.
Thank you, Brittany. Well said. I think at this point, it would be great to walk you folks through an opportunity that kind of outlines the difference between achieving substantive equality and just achieving diversity. So as Brittany mentioned, the Canadian laws really set the standard for substantive equality and also equal outcomes. So say, for example, that we begin with a government agency that has 500 employees, 3 of them identifying as either group A in the red, B in the blue, or C in the gray. And groups A and B are 2 groups of employees that have self-identified themselves with minority groups, and C represents the majority group. So at the moment in government, the way that we measure substantive equality or have been trying to get at equality is that we compare the representation of people to their labor market availability, as Martin mentioned earlier. If we're not so lucky, in this case, it might be the 2016 census from 7 years ago. But we can take a look here and see that Group A and Group B both make up about 4% of employees, which just so happens to be about the same as their group's workforce availability. So at this point, we might go on to check the box and say, okay, equality has been achieved. But taking a deeper look into how these employees navigate the workforce once they have entered is an important distinction. So you can head to the next slide there, Shamir. So in this case, we have Group A and their annual salaries, and this is an example of the type of data that we're going to show you in just a moment. So Group A in the red, and you can see that they're pretty much evenly distributed through these different salary categories. If you hit the next slide there, Shamir. And we also have Group B, which has a bit of a difference. So we can see that most of the employees in Group B are down at the lower tiers of salary level. So just quickly in your heads, if you're interested, you can take a moment to think about which group you would prefer to be a part of if you had the choice. Maybe you could even put some answers in the chat there. We'll just take a few moments to do that. So which group, either A or B, would you prefer to be a part of if you had the opportunity to choose? Okay, and I am seeing quite a few folks responding that they'd rather be in Group A. Next slide there, Shamir. And I think that makes sense because if you take a look at the distribution through the salaries, you can see that this group has a better opportunity to move through the different salary levels. And if we take salary as a proxy for career advancement, for example, seniority, education, skills, accolades, they seem to be moving through the organization a little bit easier. So what would be the reason that Group B doesn't move forward as easily? And this is some of the data that we'd like to present for you today, and also make the case that the reason that this distribution is different is probably because of discrimination due to race.
Thanks, Catalina. And it's really interesting that, you know, we are now able to start to look at data like this. Just as Catalina has pointed out, in 2022, the Treasury Board, I believe it was in May of 2022, the Treasury Board decided to go ahead and say, all right, enough. You keep bugging us about data. We're going to go ahead and give you some data. And what they decided to do was provide data that is publicly available. And what it did was it provided disaggregated data from the visible minority subgroup. For those of you who are still struggling with kind of a lot of these terms and what's disaggregated data, think of disaggregated data, think of the word disaggregated as double click, right? So you have the visible minority subgroup, and if you went ahead and double clicked it or performed a disaggregated view on it, you would have this view. And the Treasury Board, to their credit, went ahead and provided 5 years worth of data that showed the visible minority subgroups, Black, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, etc., all of the different groups that had self-identified in the visible minority subcategory. They went ahead and they provided salary grouping information. So if you wanted to know, or if anyone in the country or the world wanted to know within the Treasury Board, again, core public service, if you wanted to know how many Black employees earned between $80,000 to $85,000, you could actually find that out from the individuals who self-identified. So this is where I will say the brilliance of Dr. Nicholas has come in. So Dr. Nicholas took this data and said, let's go ahead and take this salary data and let's try to break it into 5 even groups. If we go ahead and we look at these 5 even groups, we're trying to go ahead and break all of these groups into 5 equal groups that have an equal representation as much as possible. So based on that, we were able to go ahead and provide a disproportionality index. And that is that kind of the level 1 that you see in the dotted line. If there's anything above a 1, that is considered an overrepresentation. That level basically indicates to you what the average employee, forget about what their background is, the average core public service employee, where their rate is at. So that's where you can start to go ahead and do a comparative analysis around what different groups are earning and in what level of the salary that they're in. So before we get into this data, you will see that this data is broken into 5 groups: under 60,000, 60 to 69,900, 70 to 84,900, 85 to 99, and 100,000 and over. So the reason it's broken into those 5 groups is those 5 groups are as close to 20% as possible. It's not exact based on the data that we've been given, but it actually serves as a really great kind of index for us to go ahead and do a comparative analysis. So I'm going to go ahead and steal Catalina's idea, and I'm going to go ahead and ask you all within the chat to go ahead and put down the group, the color group you would like to be part of. So I come in, I've just been announced as all of your bosses, and I get to choose, or I get to tell you, you can choose whichever color group you would absolutely like to be part of. Which group amongst all of these colors would you like to be part of? And you can just type in the chat. So a few people are saying red. Everyone is saying red. Okay, that's great. I joke that I do this a lot of the time to see if people are paying attention, and so I'm glad that so many people are. That's great, because data can get kind of overwhelming at times. Of course, we all want to be part of red, and the reason that we want to be part of red is because there's an equal distribution of individuals at that level for all 5 different salary groups. There's a tiny bit of underrepresentation at the lower salary groups, at the lower salary ranges, and there is a little bit of a higher salary range at the a higher level of overrepresentation at the higher salary ranges. So which group would you not like to be part of? Like, absolutely. You say, Shamir, I don't want to be part of that group whatsoever. Which group would you not like to be part of? Okay, Rezia says blue. We've got some other blues, some dark blues. Okay, and that's correct. The reason we don't want to be part of the blue is because the blue has a massive overrepresentation at the lower salary levels and a really massive underrepresentation at the higher salary levels. So we absolutely don't want to be part of the group in blue. So now comes the unveil here. So if we go ahead and we look at this data, the red group are the non-visible minority employees. And as you can see, the red group has that equal distribution. So if you are a non-visible minority employee, there is an equal distribution for all of those salary levels, right? So it's a little bit of lower salary level, a little bit of a underrepresentation at the lower salary level, and a little bit of a overrepresentation at the higher salary level. If you look over at the orange group, that's visible minorities. So if you're at visible minorities, it actually does kind of follow the trend that we see in the blue group, although it is a little bit closer to that 1.00 index line. But there is a little bit of overrepresentation at the lower salary levels and underrepresentation at the higher salary levels. If you look at employees with disabilities, it's very similar to the visible minorities, and there's even a little bit more of an overrepresentation at the significantly lower salary levels with an overrepresentation and underrepresentation as we go on. Indigenous employees are quite interesting. You can actually see a little bit of an overrepresentation at the lower salary groups, and then there's a little bit of an overrepresentation from 85 to 100,000. But as soon as you get to over 100,000, there is a dramatic decrease, which is very telling, right? It is extremely telling that all of a sudden you get into that $100,000 range, salary range, and the Indigenous representation there is really, really low. And the final group, which is the group that we've all said that we don't want to be part of because of their massive overrepresentation at the lower salary levels and the massive underrepresentation at the higher salary levels, are Black employees. This is, as Martin said, irrevocable evidence that Black employees are massively underrepresented at the higher salary levels. And so this is the type of analysis that we've been able to do because the Treasury Board has decided to share the salary results in terms of grouping statistically for us. And it's from that data that we're able to go ahead and bring this out. There may be questions around other groups. I know a question, Martin, that's come up many times is, where are women represented here? Where are the genders? And to that, I have said repeatedly that, we're as good as the data that we've been presented. And some of this data we have because the Treasury Board has shared it, and other data we do not have. And I think that the other very important thing to note here is this is for the core public service only. This is not representative of those agencies and departments that are not part of the core public service. Notably, CRA is not in this analysis. So we're working with CRA to try to get this data, and I'm sure with the amount of executives that we've gone to present this at, and hopefully be presenting in more higher arenas and forums, that we'll be able to get this data one day. But there's 60,000 employees that are not represented in these numbers, and that would be another interesting input to see exactly how is an agency like the CRA doing. As I'm a CRA employee, I will say, are we doing better? Is there something that we're doing that we can share with the rest of the government of Canada and with the core public service in terms of the successes we have? Or are we the same, or are we a little bit lower, in which case we have some work to do? So kind of continuing on here, again, I won't go through this data in detail, but we actually have the numbers here in terms of what that visualization showed. And I just wanted to say hats off to both Catalina and Brittany, who have put the visualizations together that I need to publicly say in front of 300 people or however many we have, that it has been very, very meaningful. And grateful to both of you for the work that you did in helping us with that visualization. So this is the actual raw data. It is included in all of your presentations, and feel free to go ahead and look at this in a lot more detail. Here is another very simple visualization that both Catalina and Brittany have put together that illustrates the difference between non-visible minorities and Black employees in terms of the discrepancy and the disproportional equality that we have between these two groups. And so this is kind of where things are at. One other slide here in terms of data, and I think somebody, I'm trying to keep up with the chat. I'm sorry, I'm failing with it. And Catalina, Brittany, Martin, if there's things in the chat that you want to bring up, please let me know. But I did see in passing, somebody had asked a question around baseline, which is a really great question. And again, I will preface this by saying we are at the mercy at what the Treasury Board decides to share. But I think now that the cat is out of the bag and the Treasury Board has decided to share this, again, for the core public service, not for other agencies that are not part of the core public service, I think this will be coming annually. And as we can see, some of the comparative analysis that Dr. Nicholas has done, we're able to actually see that the baseline, if you want to call it a baseline, can be established from 2017. And the reason it's established in 2017 is those are the numbers we've been given. And as you can see from each one of these groups, there's progress. There's progress for every group. It may not be a major amount of progress, but there is a little bit of progress, with the exception of one group. And there's one group in terms of the Black group median salary, whose salary has gone down and then has gone up as of 2021. So it actually demonstrates that not only has there traditionally not been progress made, but there's actually been, in some cases, regression. We're going to continue to go ahead and look at this and try to see what we can do about reporting on this, and we really hope this becomes a staple in Statistics Canada reporting. Let me just continue to move on here. In terms of the next steps, we certainly want to encourage here publicly and also privately for separate agencies that are not part of the core public service to share their disaggregated employment equity salary data so that we can have a fulsome Government of Canada data set. We also are very happy to announce that the Disproportionality Index will be presented at the 64th Annual ISI World Statistics Congress on July 16th to 20th held here in Ottawa. And that will be a really great opportunity to provide this analysis in a statistics community and have this kind of seen by a larger audience. One of the things that I know Dr. Nicholas is going to be looking at, and Dr. Nicholas, I'll throw it over to you to kind of talk about this, is to look at the disproportionality index in addition to the labor market availability. What's really interesting is the last Indian meeting we had, the timing of it was great because we actually heard from Statistics Canada. And Laurent from Statistics Canada, when he was talking about the labor market availability, and for those of you who were there at the last meeting, this will be very, very beneficial for you. He did say that I cannot agree more that labor market availability is vastly outdated. I cannot agree more that labor market availability is vastly outdated. And we are now in a place where we can use things like DemoSim that Laurent did a great job of explaining at the last meeting, where we can use projection models to show us what the population of Canada is going to be. Because currently we are using labor market availability as the threshold on what our hiring should be. And we all know that labor market availability today is based on 2016 data and will continue to be until late this year. It's unacceptable and it cannot continue. We need to go ahead and look at better models, and hats off to Justice Canada and the leadership there for acknowledging this and having the courage to go ahead and say, you know what, we're going to do things differently. So the changes are beginning, and the changes are beginning in a meaningful way. And the last thing I'll say before I throw over to Dr. Nicholas on this is that we continue to build awareness of the DI, of the Disproportionality Index in the Government of Canada, and show how evidence-based data can continue to drive decision-making. Dr. Nicholas, is there anything you'd like to add to this?
Thank you, Shamir. You did a great job. So did Catalina and Brittany. Because the visualization is very powerful and the explanations that each one of you did was excellent. So, and that's why it's not surprising that we are able to actually do a presentation and a paper for the International Statistical Institute conference. Because I've been in the government for 30 years and done so many innovative things, but it was very difficult to get publications out of the work that I did, even though I was in a scientific field because of the various political drawbacks. So having said that, I must just go back and talk again about labor market availability and workforce availability. Because there is in the chat various comments that sometimes can be misleading. So the question is, under the EE Act, as part of substantive equality in terms of equality of outcomes, the Act actually was trying to sort of say, here we have to set up numbers called availability, and you have to meet those numbers. So the idea, the intent of the law, of the legislation, was that we'll actually get the actual availability numbers. And so therefore, we will actually measure equality of outcomes. But it never happened because always the so-called availability numbers lagged by 6 to 7 or sometimes 10 years. So the thing that is great about last month's presentation here at IDNEED was by StatsCan in terms of DemoSim. So that DemoSim data, and you all who participated, I think Marilyn shared the Excel sheet that gives you the LMA projections for 2021 up till 2028. So if you look at that, you can see that clearly from 2021 to 2026, the next census, the visible minority group is predicted to increase by 20%. whereas the other groups are not expected to change by less than 5%. So this tells me now, without any doubt, that what we have been saying in the past, that this WFA not projecting WFAs is most damaging to the visible minorities. And this proves it. And so what we are saying is that using 2016 numbers for visible minorities in 2023 is not acceptable because you underestimate availability by 20%. So if the availability should be 100, you might call it 80. And so 20 people are potentially not being hired, and things will be saying, and they will say it's okay. And the sad thing is that many departments, when they report the availability and the matching to the availability, they never make a mention in a serious, maybe a small footnote saying these are 2016 numbers, but never talk about the significance of that. So I hope that the call to action, which Robert McCleary will be talking about, will actually demand that. And the other thing is we do employment systems review. The employment systems review should identify that currently what we are doing is a systemic racial discrimination against visible minorities with respect to the use of out-of-date WFAs and LMAs. So there's a lot to talk about that, and we can continue. Now, I also saw in the chats that they have identified other groups that may be having not part of the equity groups, but equity-seeking groups that may be having problems. There was a mention of Roma, and I do agree that Roma people worldwide have problems, and we should address that. Right now, we do not have the data for that, but that is something that I would be committing to do in the future. But for generations, Black people, Black Canadians have suffered. Even when it comes to land, they were part of the settler group, but they didn't have the benefits of settlers. So there was land that was given by the Crown in Nova Scotia and Ontario because the Black brigades that fought in the war, but they were never given the full ownership. So there is a lot of history in terms of this. And colorism is a real huge problem, not only in Canada, but across the world. And for example, I have taken it upon myself over the last 20 to 25, 30 years to eliminate any reference of darkness or dark as bad, because I believe that gets into your psyche, and you cannot be an anti-racist if you have colorism in your mind. I know that the media provides that, creates that in us, but that's not a good enough answer. You have to actively look inside yourself and say, no, I'm going to fight it. Even today, I get dragged into that when I watch the TV or anything else about having that bias. But I have to hold myself back and say, no, it's not right. And we need to fight it. We need to fight it in our language. We need to never say a dark period in our life. That is a careless use of English language. What you're saying is not dark. It's something else. Is it sad or is it difficult? So talk about it that way. Don't just use dark in that sense. It doesn't make sense. It's not scientific. So thank you for now.
Thanks, Dr. Nicholas. And I'm really appreciative of all the questions and the comments that are coming in. And before we get into the questions, earlier this week, Anil Arora, the chief statistician from Statistics Canada, said that providing high quality data and insights for evidence-based decision making is more and more a team sport. And what I will say is that it's been wonderful to be part of this team. Dr. Martin Nicholas from the Department of Justice, Catalina Albury from Statistics Canada, Brittany Vongdara from Statistics Canada, the Data Science Network, who basically came and did a peer review of the work that we've done, and the Anti-Racism Ambassadors Network, IDNID as well. The support we've received for this has been really something special. And I know that this work will have a lasting impression on those that are receiving it. But now the question is, now that we know this, now what? What do we do with it? And we don't have all the answers for that, but we do have the evidence that there are challenges. So with that, we can try to take some questions.